Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Educate to Self-Regulate. This particular episode, we're trying something a little bit different here. I've been playing with a number of ideas this year around different podcast formats and new co-hosts and all sorts of things. But this year's really been a lot about guests coming on and sharing some of their practice and insights. But I wanted to start to bring in a bit more expertise, a bit of deeper thinking, and a slightly longer form episode to allow for that deeper thinking in relation to self-regulated learning. Today, I have the lovely Kath Murdoch joining me. Kath, I was looking at your bio, so I'm going to share a little bit and you can correct me if I've got it wrong.
Okay. I don't know.
So
Yeah, go for it.
I
Thank
agreed
you.
with the bio as I was reading it. It said that your name is synonymous with inquiry learning, and that has been my experience to date, Kat. You've got 40 years in the game in education or possibly consultancy alone. I'm not sure. I wanted to clarify that
No,
with
no,
you.
no, yeah.
But then I read there you've been a primary teacher, a writer, a university lecturer, and consultant, and you've published 17 books, which blew my mind.
That's
Uh,
because I'm old, okay? It's just because I'm old.
I don't know if that's a good
Over a long period of time.
justification. 17 books. I've written one, and I know the journey to write that book, to collect the information, to develop the knowledge to be able to write that in a form that was accessible for educators. So, congratulations on 17 books. Kath, welcome to the podcast. How are you
Thank
today?
you. I'm really well, thank you. All the better for seeing you and having the opportunity to chat with someone whose work I admire so much. So thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Kath. And it's such a pleasure to have you here as the sort of first guest in this long form podcast because
I'm honored.
we have a bit of well, I'm going to call it a special relationship because
We do.
we have connected through a school partner, which we both worked with for a number of years, and Benithan Primary School have been a friend of ours for a long
Mm,
time. I think I met Benithan back in 2020
mhm.
during COVID, and actually started working with them as a critical friend, and then continued the journey in helping them promote and foster self-regulated learning. But you equally were working or had been working alongside them for a number of years
Yeah,
already.
that's
When
right.
did you start with Benithan?
Gosh. It's a bit blurry because I worked with the leadership group in other schools in Canberra as well. So it's all, I feel like I've just known
Blur.
them all my teaching life, at least 10 years, at least.
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, and that partnership continues today. It evolves, things change, all of that. But they've been such a great school to work with.
I agree completely. And they actually introduced me to you. Well, Amanda Hawkins and Greg Terrell, the
Mm.
then principal, introduced me to you, Kath, actually around
Mm.
the same time as I was drafting my manuscript,
That's
just about to
right.
submit to my
Yeah.
publisher. And we had connected on email. And I thought I should ask Kath if she will review my book. And
No,
this is
we're
like 2 weeks
so
out from submission to my,
good.
I was like, I'll ask Kath.
Yeah.
And you so kindly, generously agreed to review my book in the short time frame that I was working to. I think you said you had a long haul flight, and you were like, "Yeah, I can have a look at
Yeah.
it."
Give me something to read. And it was such a great read. I'd already been given a heads up, and we'll talk about this shortly. I remember Mark and Amanda saying to me at the time, because I'd heard a lot about what you were doing, and they kept saying there's such alignment between this work and what you're doing. I think you've got to meet Shy. And so when you asked me to look at the manuscript, I thought, okay, now I can dig in and see what they're talking about here. And of course, I'm sure that if people were watching me on that long haul flight, they would have seen me vigorously nodding my head and maybe doing little claps or whoop, things like that, because it aligned beautifully. So, yeah, hence our conversation today.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm deeply appreciative for that connection, and then the follow-up connection at Benithan Primary School, where we got to be part of a fireside chat, which is
Mhm.
really this conversation here is building on that
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
We're thinking about the synergies between our work, the cross sections between self-regulated learning and inquiry learning, and also perhaps touching on the current conversation in education
Mhm.
around different pedagogical approaches.
Yeah.
And I thought actually, Kath, it's something that's happening here in the ACT is what are they calling it? The strong foundations. There's a piece around the public education here where there's a
Mhm.
series of recommended practices
Mhm.
or government supported endorsed practices, one of which I believe is guided inquiry. And so I thought I might ask you for some clarity around the concept of inquiry for our listeners
Mhm.
who might not be familiar
Mhm.
with it. Like, how do you define inquiry? And is guided inquiry, like, is that different or is that the same as?
I get a bit bamboozled by the various ways people over the years try and differentiate between all these different kinds of inquiry. For me, guided inquiry, almost the word guided in it feels redundant. It's like, what do you mean? Is what's unguided inquiry? And if it's unguided, what on earth are you doing? I think all the work we do to have children engaged in a process of inquiry is always guided. The level of guidance will vary according to the difficulty of perhaps the material they're working with or the child's own needs. So it varies. The guidance might be less, it might be more, but it's always guided. So it's a term of course, I know the term, but I would argue that everything, certainly all the work I've ever done, if I had to relabel it guided inquiry, that would sit with me just fine. I mean, if you ask me, how would I define it? And I think one of the challenges of inquiry is the difficulty that we've had over, I was about to say decades, and then I want to say centuries now, to define something that is actually a really complex and big concept, but that's not particularly helpful for people. So I'm going to just say that first and foremost, it's an approach to teaching and learning that has at its heart really strong valuing and prioritizing of curiosity, of investigation, and of meaning making. And with that, with guidance, now I always say that, but with guidance, it positions learners as researchers to investigate questions, to learn how to analyze information that they gather, to think big and think deep and think for themselves. And also, in many cases, to use the learning to take some kind of action. And we often use the phrase to take action to make a positive difference to their lives or the lives of others. So that, in a nutshell, I'd say that. But I also see it as a stance and, this a way of being as an educator, which we can talk about later. I would say in defining it that it is a sophisticated, it's a beautiful way to teach, but it is quite demanding. And to do it well, you need a pretty sophisticated repertoire. You need to know how to ask high quality questions. You need to be able to design learning experiences that where the students are really actively thinking without overloading them, and that there's a real art to it. It's not for the faint-hearted. And I guess the other thing I would say about it is that it reflects often in the early years, there's a phrase we use called slow pedagogy. So think about the slow food movement
Yeah.
and in the same way, inquiry embraces a pedagogy that pushes back against the frantic notion of get it done, get through it, cover it, move on to the next thing, the fast-paced sit and get. And it is a pedagogy that is deliberately mindful and slower, something teachers often comment when we do our learning labs where I'm teaching and they're observing that pace. And that I probably should say, I don't know whether your listeners are aware, just in case they're not, that the bulk of my work over all the years has been from the early years through to about year 6, year 7. So a lot of what I'm sharing with you comes from early childhood through to the end of primary and some middle years, but that's where all my work has been.
Thanks, Kath. I was madly writing down notes. I hope that's okay, Kath. I'm
Of
writing notes as we
course.
chat. You use the word art, and I think, you spoke about this body of knowledge that underpins
Mm,
this art of being
mm,
able to, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the right language here, to support inquiry learning in schools. You made the comment around that art, that careful kind of crafting of that experience is both about facilitating that journey of learning, but also not overloading them. Now,
mm,
yeah, I heard that word overloading and I thought of cognitive load. It's a hot
mm,
topic right now,
mm.
which has led to perhaps some educators.
It's a direct criticism of inquiry is that or cognitive load theory is often used as the argument against using an inquiry-based approach. If you think of inquiry or you conduct an inquiry approach by adopting a kind of minimal guidance philosophy,
Yep.
and it's a famous paper that constantly gets referred to, which is Sweller's paper, Why a Minimal Guidance Approach is Ineffective. And I can only agree, of course it is, but that's not what inquiry is. And if that's what people think it is, they haven't quite got the big picture. So the other thing is that while we acknowledge the importance of understanding cognitive load, if you just think about that theory or understand that theory in isolation without also understanding other theories about learning that you would know all too well, for example, the power of self-regulation to reduce cognitive load. When you are motivated, curious, and interested, how that reduces cognitive load, or rather, it motivates you to work through something that you might find overwhelming were you not so interested in it, and the power of collaboration and working with others. So there are many other inputs if you think about what constitutes effective learning for kids, and many other theories that we need to attend to. And I do worry a little that the cognitive load theory, whilst having an absolute place, has become the sort of the theory that is being used to justify a whole bunch of things without reference to some of these other elements.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned that. I was at the Australian Council for Educational Leaders conference a couple of weeks ago, and
Mhm.
Dr. Steph McMahon from the University of Queensland was sharing a presentation on I think it was titled The Real Science of Learning. And she started with a retrieval practice exercise, which, is a cognitive strategy to
Mhm.
help retrieve
Yeah,
or activate prior knowledge or to strengthen those
yeah,
connections. And she asked the leaders, I'm sharing this because I think it's pertinent to what you're sharing here,
yeah,
is
yeah.
that within the sort of the cognitive strategies that are often kind of celebrated, they're underpinned by cognitive load or
Mhm.
retrieval practice being one of those examples. Steph's activity where she was getting leaders to retrieve in the moment, engage in a retrieval practice exercise. It was a very short activity. And then she asked the adult learners in the room, how did it make you feel? And a lot of them said it was painful, it was a real struggle, it was uncomfortable, and so on and so forth. And then she asked them, what did you want to do? And the adult learners said they wanted to go back to their notes and just revisit it, which, some will say the act of retrieving is that productive struggle. So that's not always helpful. But some of the adult learners said, I wanted to talk to my colleagues about my prior learning. And what Steph was trying to highlight here is there are many ways that we can learn. It's not always the retrieval practice, these kind of hammering of cognitive strategies. That's one way we can learn, absolutely. And she was not refuting that.
No,
She
no,
was
no.
just merely saying that collaborative learning, conversations with our colleagues,
Mhm.
is like a human instinct almost. Like it was something that the adult learners in the room were saying that they wanted to do
Yes.
to further and deepen their understanding as well. And so I think you're right. We're seeing, at least in the conversations that I'm a part of as well, I'm seeing this overemphasis maybe on the cognitive
Yeah.
domain.
A narrowing. And even, I mean, you mentioned the science of learning. It's interesting. I wonder if you went back through every single podcast that I've ever done, I bet you wouldn't, that you would find that I never get through a podcast without mentioning my friend, mentor, and colleague, Guy Claxton, Professor Guy Claxton, who is a cognitive scientist and a highly respected one around the world, who reminds us constantly there is no such thing as the science of learning.
Yeah.
There are sciences of learning, and you would know this, of course, Shai, being a PhD scholar yourself, but and he constantly reminds us of the breadth of ways of thinking about and understanding learning and the dangers of a narrow, blinkered vision. But yeah, wow, we went there really quickly, didn't
We
we?
did, didn't we? Look at there's
Next question.
I want to get into it because I know our listeners, a lot of our listeners are educators, they're teachers,
Mm,
practitioners, and
mm,
really thinking about how they can leverage inquiry for self-regulated learning. I think fundamentally that's really
mm.
important for us to get to.
Yeah,
But before we do, Kat, I would love to just clarify language because we were
yeah.
talking about it before we hit record on the podcast. There's a lot of I don't know if conceptual clutter is the right word, but there's different language being used in education, direct
Mm,
instruction, explicit instruction,
mm,
inquiry or guided inquiry, and so on and so forth.
mm.
It's overwhelming for some teachers to understand the difference, let
Yeah.
alone think about, like, I think some are positioning them as opposing forces, and they're not always opposing forces. Where does inquiry sit with these other approaches? How would you define or position direct instruction, explicit instruction, inquiry?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting hearing you differentiate between direct, explicit inquiry. So they've also been mushed together in some contexts, which I find frustrating. So much of the literature around this work would suggest that oftentimes when people are talking about direct instruction, they're referring to often scripted instruction where you follow a sequence of very clear, direct steps in your instruction to students. You're following a script. These days, you're often using a bank of slides to do it. So there is a sequence and a script. So the teacher direct instruction context, the way I'm describing it and the way I've read about it, an interesting way of thinking about it is that the teacher doesn't have a lot of agency in that. It's like it's a program, or you're following, as I say, you're following these instructions. So it's not a lot of wriggle room. Explicit teaching, and I would say that kind of approach doesn't connect particularly strongly with an inquiry stance. There might be some tiny threads that do sometimes, okay, but I can think of a few examples, but overall, that's further away. But explicit teaching for me actually sits inside this idea of inquiry-based teaching and learning, and that the explicit teaching, i.e., explaining, modeling, demonstrating, taking that moment to say, I'm going to explain to you how this works, or let me show you this, or whatever it might be. Very clear, very explicit. That is in my repertoire as an inquiry teacher. I don't think I would ever do a lesson without some explicit teaching. However, it's not so it totally sits in the repertoire, but it wouldn't be my dominant approach. So this is a very rough way of putting it, but I would say, okay, maybe if explicit teaching was my main approach, that might be 80% of my lesson, and then be 20% where the kids were doing more figuring out from themselves. And maybe in a lot of the work that I do, that's flipped. And so it's a smaller part. Or if I often have an image in my head of a paint palette, and that really explicit teaching pieces, maybe it's the brown and the black on the paint palette, and I'm dipping into it at the point of need. It can make a massive difference. It's really important I've got those paint colors there, but I'm not dipping into them nearly as much as I am some of my other colors. I don't know if that metaphor works. I use it more at the point of need, and it's dependent on, like I said before, the child, the complexity of the content. I'm not going to teach children to swim using a pure guided discovery, guided inquiry approach. I'm going to be much more explicit then. Um, so it's a little dependent on the context. But I like to clarify the difference between those three. And others would disagree, but that's the framing. I'm all for explicit teaching as part of the inquiry repertoire.
And this is something we spoke about at Benoith and when we were
Mm,
there for that little fireside chat.
mm,
It's almost like these pedagogies are placed on this continuum of kind of level of student autonomy of such. It's strange to me.
mm, mm.
From a self-regulated learning perspective, I think I made the comment at that fireside chat that self-regulated learning doesn't really discriminate between these approaches. Like they all can benefit
Yeah,
self-regulated learning in really valuable ways. Um,
yeah,
and we can, and I tend to use explicit instruction, but some of the literature will argue for direct instruction,
mm,
where we are being, the level of teacher guidance based on the level of student need is explicitly teaching the
yeah,
conceptual knowledge or the
yeah,
strategic knowledge that
yeah,
students need to self-regulate their
yeah,
learning.
yeah.
And that's important, but there's also really key elements. So, I'm thinking of Charlotte Dignan's research. She had in one of her research articles, she had this kind of beautiful diagram that had kind of the direct instruction, explicit instruction approaches and the indirect instruction approaches, which was kind of more environmental, the type of
Mm.
environment that you create, which I would still argue has quite a level of teacher influence and
Oh, of course.
isn't it?
Because it's you're designing that too.
Yeah, and she was saying you really need both based on the research around self-regulated learning. Both are fundamental to promoting this skill set, which
Hmm.
we all agree is fundamentally important and even critically more important today in the world of tech and AI and so on and so
Yeah,
forth.
yeah, yeah. It's a continuum. And I think for me, using that terminology, maybe with the language we use, the important thing is to always stay curious when we're having those conversations. And when someone says, "Oh, no, I used a direct instruction. That's what I use," and that's mm, the important question I have to remind myself to ask is, "Oh, that's really interesting. What do you mean? What do you mean by direct
Yes.
instruction?" Because or what do you mean by explicit teaching? And sometimes when they talk about it, it's like, oh, yeah, oh no, we're talking about the same thing here. So it is that moment just to clarify with each other. And as Rumi says, find the field beyond. It's not one or the other.
Yes.
False dichotomies exist all through education. Unfortunately, I've only ever known that to be true, whether it's in the literacy field or now in the broader learning field. They probably always will. Human beings like things to be black and white, cut and dried. It's this or this. But one of the features of inquiry, somewhat appropriately for this conversation, is that the teacher that works this way has to be able to sit comfortably in uncertainty and nuance. And so do children. And that's when we're talking about these things, we've also got to be reminded that there is no one right, there's no such thing as best practice. It's best practice in the context,
Yes.
that context for these children at this time with this teacher.
Yep. I love that. And I love that. And I hope our listeners are hearing the importance of making those strategic decisions, that they're feeling empowered as evidence-informed practitioners, that they're thinking about the many different approaches that they can draw on in a single
Mm.
moment, and they're making that choice based on the needs of the learners in front of them. I think that's important.
Yeah.
So they're
And
working.
based on, I guess, their ultimately, we do have to think about that big question, what is school for? I have multiple roles as a teacher. I have a massive repertoire in the service of what? And for me, it is, I feel my role is to do whatever I can to nurture that agency. I want to grow these agentic young people that know what to do when they don't know, that have a really high level positive regard for themselves as a learner and a sense that they can make a positive difference to their lives and the lives of others, that they've got a toolkit to do that, and that they are knowledgeable and caring and all of those dispositions that we talk about, and that it's driven by those values again of agency and curiosity and so on. So if school is only a place that we see as this is a place where you go to get the best possible mark to do, to get into that course at university, to get and so on. Maybe or if primary school is a place where you've got the most important thing is your NAPLAN results, then you may well choose pedagogy that is
Yeah.
more transmission, direct instruction oriented. Can get a initial rise in results, of course you can. So you have to also think about, yes, the wide repertoire, yes, all the different approaches, but most importantly, what's the purpose? What are we here to do? What's our role?
So, Kath, I don't know if you saw this. There was the Athens Innovation Summit was held a couple of weeks ago,
Hmm.
and the Greek Prime Minister was sitting in a conversation with Google DeepMind CEO Demi.
Did not see it, no.
Google DeepMind is their AI research lab. The interviewer asked Google DeepMind CEO, given the way tech and AI is evolving, what is
Mm.
the most important thing that schools need to be doing for their young people? And he said that teaching young people how to learn skill set was fundamental to maintaining
Mm.
agency with AI. And that's
Yeah,
been reported in other research papers as well. So
yeah, Yeah, yeah.
fundamentally important. And you mentioned before that inquiry can sometimes be considered a stance, a way of being.
Yes.
How does that stance, that way of being, support this
Mm.
process of how to learn?
Really beautifully is what I want to say. If you understand it and you know how to do it well, I often use the phrase a journey of inquiry. We take children on this journey of inquiry that we carefully design to support them as active participants in building understanding of something over time. So they might be, for example, inquiring into the concept of adaptation through the lens of biological science and so on. And we'll design that journey with and for them in order to reach a deeper understanding of adaptation and meet our curriculum and all of that. I would argue that the highest quality inquiry teachers I know do that beautifully, but they have a second layer, like a parallel track that runs with, or even better, maybe a way of thinking about it is more like it's woven into it. And that second track is while we are coming to, we're deepening our understanding of adaptation in the living world, we are also coming to understand more about ourselves as learners. So as we go through this process, we might be examining the question, what does it mean to adapt? And that's our science question, for example. And I'll say to children, and while we're doing this, we are also continuing to try and figure out what does it mean to be a really effective learner? And then, so because this is because the stance is one of constant curiosity and noticing, when you do a good job with inquiry-based learning, you're often asking kids questions like, oh, what are you noticing about this data that we've gathered about these species, for example? Or what are you noticing about how we went about this research? Oh, what are you noticing about your thinking right now? Let's go back to what you used to think about this. How's your thinking changed? I wonder why our thinking changed. So you're using all these beautiful inquiry questions that are as much about inquiring into the self as they are about inquiring into, if you like, the content of that inquiry. So I always say to teachers, every journey of inquiry you take your children on is an opportunity to build that stance of relentless curiosity in the learner about this thing we call learning and about themselves as learners, as well as bringing the teacher being a researcher. This is from the Joe Amelia philosophy, the idea of teacher as researcher. So that's an inquiry stance where the teacher's constantly asking, what am I noticing? What's going on here? What are the kids revealing to me? Where might we go next? All of that. But I also want the kids to have that stance. So by its nature, inquiry as a culture, as a way of being, encourages us to reflect, to notice, and then to be more intentional about where we go next. And that's at the macro level of a journey of inquiry as it unfolds. It's also at the micro level. It's also in one lesson where I often invite children. In fact, I was in Hong Kong last week teaching all week with labs while teachers are watching. And we had one really interesting lesson where one of the things I wanted to model was that intentionality before the children move into a task. Just that little moment of wondering, I wonder what we might need to do to help ourselves approach this really effectively. Where have we done this sort of thing before? Oh, that's right. So what do we remember from that? What might we need to do next? All the stuff you talk about, Chai. That whole way of being is, for me, what it means to be an inquirer. It's not just about inquiring into the world outside us, it's about inquiring into the world inside us.
So, Kath, I want to make some really clear connections because as you were talking, I was thinking, I think the parts of my brain around metacognitive prompting were lighting up because I
Yeah.
was thinking, wow, every question that you're asking students is what we call metacognitive prompting. We're prompting
Yep.
students to reflect about
Hmm.
themselves as a learner or their learning process.
Yep,
That has a really sound evidence base around
it
promoting
does.
self-regulated learning
Yep.
skills. You were using the word journey, I guess the synergy there with self-regulated learning. We often think of self-regulated learning as three phases: planning, monitoring, and evaluating,
Mm.
or perhaps forethought, performance, and self-reflection. There's different language
Yeah,
there, but this journey where
very
students,
aligned.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, really quite,
Whether it's again inquiry within a lesson or inquiry over your life,
yes,
but those elements, we're doing that too. That's how we actually, a good quality journey of inquiry for our children is one where they not only understand how their understanding has grown and changed, but how they help themselves get there. So that I'm always talking to teachers about how we like to narrate the journey as it unfolds, like literally create a wall that shows the journey. And we try to use that meta language you're talking about. In fact, I saw an amazing one with grade 5 kids at Riverside Primary, another partner school in Tassie, earlier this year, where the children had actually documented on the wall their thinking, what they noticed about the difference between researching something on your own and collaborating with peers and engaging in the same kind of research. And then it was so meta. It was research about research while they were researching. It's elevating your teaching and elevating even young children's thinking. So we lift ourselves up out of the activity
yeah.
and the content to kind of, I always think of it as getting up in a hot air balloon and looking down at what's happening. How's this all working?
It's so interesting thinking about this because I'm a secondary school trained teacher.
Mm.
I've never taught
Mhm.
inquiry in the way that it might manifest in a primary school,
Mm.
but I was a science teacher. So the
Oh,
scientific
there you go.
inquiry
Use that
question
example. Yeah.
is so common in the way that we teach science across secondary school. So it's really fascinating for me thinking about the synergies here. Not only are you as or teachers that are adopting an inquiry approach where they're using these questions as metacognitive prompts, but it sounds like they're also modeling their own thinking out loud around how they're navigating this, which I think would be really powerful. And then I think there's an opportunity here for us to explicitly teach these questions, these inquiry questions to our learners to help them navigate learning processes so that they can
Yeah,
start to internalize these questions as well and
that's
start going,
right.
right.
You start to hear them do it with each other.
Yeah.
So another school that I've worked at for many years in Melbourne, Mother Teresa Primary School, for a long time, Ron Richart worked with the staff and so did I. And when I work with those children, they will say, without even using a routine, like what makes you say that, for example, which
Yeah.
is a lovely little thinking routine, the grade 3 children, the grade 2 children will, I'll ask them something. I'll say, so, what do you think about blah, blah? And they'll say, oh, I think this. And what makes me say that is, so it's become, because they've had it very explicitly identified,
Yeah.
not in an explicit doesn't have to be didactic. Explicit is clear, isn't it? It's just it's like, making sure that we're kind of lifting the bonnet of the car to look at the engine and go, this is how it works. Have a look at this. And yeah, that for me is the richness of an inquiry stance.
So there's beautiful synergies here, Kath. I'm so conscious of time.
Mm.
Time will get away from us.
Mm.
Before we get into our on the reg segment, I'll ask you one more question. I
Okay.
had this broad question here, which was what are some of the practical ways teachers can intentionally scaffold student self-regulated learning
Yeah.
in an inquiry unit? And we've spoken about a few already. Are there any others that we've missed that you think are worthwhile mentioning?
Well, I'm going to use one that whenever I talk about it or share it with people, they'll often respond really well to it. I'm going to shout out to Guy Claxton because the idea of it is from him, but I think I've inquirified it a bit, and
Okay.
he knows if that's, oh, I've just made that word up. Anyway, and that is this idea of the split screen learning intention, and the learning intention as a question, and you would have seen that at Benithan. So
Yeah.
it might be, for example, that we have the intention of, as a result of our lesson, the intention for our learning today might be, I don't know, I'm just thinking of a grade 6 class earlier this year where in the lesson we were looking at as a sort of a history focus, and it was the children trying to identify the relationship between these different case studies of how people stood up for their rights over time. So instead of we are learning about how significant Australians stood up for their rights throughout history, it was how can or how have people stood up for their rights? That's not exactly the right question. I can't quite remember it, but something like that. So we turn that into a question. And then next to it, so I'll say to the kids, so we're going to be continuing to explore this question during this lesson today. We've been thinking a lot about this. We're going to keep trying to find out about it, which leads, of course, to a quick bit of, if you like, retrieval practice when I say, oh, actually, just let's check in. What have we discovered about this so far? Turn to your partner and just tell them what you remember from the last session on this. What was something we discovered? How have we answered this question so far? But then I'll write up, and while we're doing this, I'm going to give you an example from one of what I call the learning assets. So I might say, while we're doing this, as self-managers, let's see what else we notice today about how you can help yourself stay focused when you are engaged in a collaborative task, because the task they're about to do is a really collaborative one and they've had trouble staying focused. Then I'll say, well, again, we'll do a little bit of retrieval practice. We've been thinking about this question too, haven't we? Do you remember some of the strategies people came up with last time? Do you remember that one I shared with you? Let's see if we can practice that today. I wonder what else we'll find out about it. So I'm putting those two things. We're learning about staying focused and we're learning about significant people in history. The learning about staying focused intention, I can pick that up and drop it in again in a math workshop that in after lunch. I'm doing that. It's like, you know what? Let's do this again. That learning intention that is more to do with self-regulation,
Yes.
I can carry that. In fact, it's very important that I do carry it across multiple contexts over the day, over the week, and that the kids are getting to A, practice, but B, also discover and unearth more. So I love the bit in the middle of a lesson where we press the pause button then and we say, okay, what else can we say about these significant people, blah, blah, blah. Now, what are people noticing about their focus? What are you noticing? What are you noticing? What strategy helped you? What did you try out? Could we add anything to our list? Or that might be the moment where, or during the lesson, I might have sidled up to a child and said, okay, I'm noticing you're having a lot of trouble staying focused. What have you tried so far? Can I show you another strategy?
Yeah.
Have a look at it. Watch me. I'm going to join the group. You watch what I do with eye contact. That can be a real help. Or you watch me. So that might be my little explicit teaching moment. So that to me, as a practical strategy, split screen learning intentions, framed as questions, used to do a bit of retrieval practice at the beginning, and then paused and reflected on during and at the end of the lesson. Then I feel like we are inquiring into the self and learning while we're inquiring into the content. It all requires better time management, sustained blocks of learning time, and a commitment to slow pedagogy.
I love that. And you actually gave me permission to include the learning asset of self-manager, I think, in my book. So
Yeah.
I'm having a moment.
Which is such a common one, whether it's mine, whether it's the IB's self-manager. And you, I think in your book, for you, it's almost synonymous. If you are managing
Yes.
self,
Yeah.
you are a self-regulator.
Self-regulated learner. So
Yeah.
that was on for any of my listeners who have the book. It's page 136, 137. That was the Bonython primary school version, but I know they had worked with you very
That's
closely
what
on.
the book looks like, everyone. Oh, I've got my blurry thing
On
on.
the
Doesn't work. Oh, there it is. Well. Anyway,
it comes and goes. Thanks.
I hold it up a lot.
Yeah, Kath, all our podcasts, short or long, always have an on the reg segment, which is
Mm,
where usually we reflect on a strategy that we personally use as adult learners to
mm.
self-regulate as a learner. What's one
Yep.
strategy that you use to self-regulate?
I think I use several, but I'm very conscious. I'm going to say again about that intentionality piece, about before I go into a situation where I need to be a learner, which is nearly every single day when I go into a school or I go into a meeting, because I'm always a learner as well as a teacher. I do, when I'm at my best, I do take a moment. I just take a moment to say it might be something like stay curious or listen with intention or, talk less or whatever it might be. But I give myself a little, like a micro goal. And I know it's something we do with kids too, but I do it a lot, even sometimes just before I get out of the car or before I walk into that meeting room is a reminder. Even that strategy you've got in your book, that one word,
Yes.
what's my word? Okay. So that,
Well, I do something very similar. I call it a pre-commitment strategy, but I have a little notebook where at
yeah,
little transition points in the day, I'll
yeah.
just take a moment, as you said, just to note down what's my intention for how I want to show up
Oh,
in,
it's everything.
in the 3 hours with my family or in the next hour at work. And I'll sometimes extend that where I'll think about what's going to get in the way and how might I mitigate that barrier.
But,
Okay.
and I need to say, I think I use the phrase when I'm at my best. I don't always do it. I regret it when I don't, but when I'm at my best, I do.
This is probably why I see self-regulated learning as a practice, because I think we show up as best as we can every
Bet.
day and hope
You
that
bet. Yeah.
and it doesn't always work out perfectly, but we just keep trying. I think that's the way.
Yeah.
Kath, it has been such a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for being
It's
my
my
first long form guest.
I am honored to be your first long form guest, and it has been such a delight. Of course, I'm going to say the usual. I feel like we only scratch the surface. There's so much alignment, but I really hope people see that and that learning, it's not like, oh, this is another thing we've got to learn. Oh, now we've got to learn about self-regulation. Yes, you do, but it's actually, it weaves in if you've got this if you bring this stance to your teaching, it's just going to enhance it. And I would say the other way around, if you want to really do a good job of supporting self-regulation with your students, bring an inquiry stance to your work and that they really help each other out. So yeah, thank you, Shai, and yeah, love your work.
Thanks, Kath. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we will no doubt continue the conversation at a later stage. In the next episode. Now this episode is quite an exciting episode for me. It has been an intention of mine for this year to record some solo episodes for you, sharing some learning around self-regulated learning and some of my thinking in this field. It's quite funny that it's now late December and a term for here in Australia at least is starting to wrap up. And it just at this time of the year, it seems pertinent to talk about metacognition and particularly a phase of metacognition known as self-reflection. So if you're not familiar with the three phases of self-regulated learning, there are a number of models that advocate for three phases of self-regulated learning. There's a lot in there, hopefully some deep value for you as you reflect on 2025, but also edge into the break moving forward in preparation for 2026.